I was 28 when I found out my family had been treating me like their personal ATM. And the worst part is how stupid they thought I was the entire time. Looking back now, I can see all the signs I missed, but when you grow up believing your family loves you, you don't exactly go around suspecting them of being criminals. That's not paranoia. That's just normal, right? Let me back up and give you the full picture because you need to understand the dynamics here. I'm the youngest of three kids. My brother Colton is 34, sister Denise is 31, and then there's me, Tiago. Growing up, I was always the quiet one, the one who kept his head down and just tried to keep everyone happy. My parents, Dominic and Shirley, made it pretty clear early on that Colton was the golden child who could do no wrong. Denise was daddy's princess who got whatever she wanted, and I was just kind of there. Not neglected exactly, just less important. The spare kid, the one who didn't quite measure up. Colton was always the star, played football in high school, got a business degree, talked a big game about being an entrepreneur, even though he'd never actually started a successful business. Denise was the social butterfly, always posting on Instagram about her amazing life, always needing money for this trip or that experience. And me? I was the boring one, the one who studied hard, got decent grades, went to a state school for computer science, and landed a regular job at a tech company doing network administration. Nothing flashy, nothing Instagram-worthy, just steady work, steady paycheck, steady life. My parents never seemed particularly proud of it, but whatever. I was supporting myself, and that was enough. When my grandmother passed away 4 years ago, she left each of us grandkids $50,000. I was 24 at the time, working my first real job out of college. And that money represented everything to me. A down payment on a house, eventually. Emergency fund, maybe start investing, financial security. The kind of stability I'd never had growing up in a family that always seemed to be juggling bills and credit card debt. The executor of grandmother's estate was my dad, which should have been my first massive red flag, but I trusted him. Why wouldn't I? He was my father. That's what you do. You trust your parents to handle important things because they're supposed to have your best interests at heart. Dad told me the inheritance was being held in a trust until I turned 25. Something about grandmother wanting to make sure we were mature enough to handle it responsibly. He said it was in the will, that she'd specified it because she worried about young people blowing through money too quickly. Made perfect sense at the time. Colton and Denise got theirs right away since they were already over 25, but mine had to wait. Dad said he'd set everything up properly. I just needed to sign some papers, which I did without really reading them because, again, trusting your parents is supposed to be normal, right? That's what functional families do. I turned 25 and asked about the money. Dad said there were complications with the trust. It would be another few months. Some issue with the bank. Paperwork hadn't been filed correctly. He was working on it. Then it was tax issues. Something about capital gains or estate taxes that needed to be resolved first. Then it was problems with the executor paperwork. Something about grandmother's lawyer retiring and files being transferred. Always something. Always another delay. Always another excuse. Eventually, I just stopped asking because every time I brought it up, Mom would get this disappointed look on her face and tell me I was being greedy and disrespectful to grandmother's memory. She'd say grandmother would be ashamed of me for caring so much about money instead of honoring her legacy. Denise would chime in about how I was being immature and proving exactly why grandmother wanted the trust in the first place. Colton would just laugh and call me entitled. So I worked. I busted my back at my job, took on extra projects, learned new skills, got promoted twice in 3 years. I saved every penny I could. I lived in a tiny studio apartment that cost $850 a month, drove a 2004 Toyota Corolla that had 180,000 miles on it, and made concerning noises whenever I accelerated. Ate ramen and rice and chicken breasts I bought in bulk. More nights than I want to admit. I wore the same 5 work outfits on rotation. I cut my own hair. I didn't go out, didn't date, didn't do anything that cost money. Meanwhile, Colton bought a house 3 years ago. Not a starter home either, a 4-bedroom place in a nice suburb with a 2-car garage. Denise took 3 vacations to Europe in 2 years, posting endless photos of herself in Paris and Rome and Barcelona. My parents renovated their entire kitchen, tore out the old cabinets and put in custom ones, got granite countertops and stainless steel appliances. But sure, I was the one being unreasonable for asking about my inheritance. I told myself it was fine. I told myself I was building my career, building my savings, building a life. I told myself the money would come eventually, and when it did, I'd be in an even better position to use it wisely. I told myself a lot of things to make it okay that my family seemed to be living large while I was counting pennies. Fast forward to 3 weeks ago, I'd been helping my parents with some house projects because that's what good sons do, right? They're in their early 60s and needed someone to move heavy boxes from their garage to a storage unit they'd rented. It was a Saturday afternoon in early September, one of those perfect fall days where the weather's just starting to cool off. I'd driven over after finishing my morning shift. I'd been pulling weekend overtime because we were short-staffed and I needed the extra money. I was in the garage folding down cardboard boxes to make them easier to recycle. Just methodical, repetitive work. Breaking down boxes, stacking them flat, moving on to the next one. The kind of mindless task that lets your brain wander. Their kitchen window was open about 15 feet away, and I could hear voices inside, but wasn't really paying attention at first. Just background noise while I worked. Then I heard Colton's voice. That particular tone he gets when he's had a few beers and feels like he can say whatever he wants. He was talking about me, said something about how pathetic I was, how I never even questioned where the money went, how I just accepted every excuse they gave me like an idiot. I stopped moving, just froze there with a flattened Amazon box in my hands. Denise laughed, this high-pitched giggle she does when she thinks something's particularly funny. She said I was too weak and spineless to ever stand up for myself, that I'd rather believe their lies than face reality. Said I was the easiest mark she'd ever seen. Then my dad spoke up. My own father. He said it was better that way, that having a son who was passive and easy to control meant they never had to worry about me causing problems. He actually used those words, easy to control. Mom joined in, said I had no friends, no girlfriend, no life outside of work. That made me the perfect target because I had nobody to tell, nobody who would notice or care if something was wrong, nobody to ask questions or give me advice. Just me, alone, trusting my family because I had no one else. Denise brought up grandmother's inheritance specifically, said she couldn't believe I'd fallen for the trust story, that it was such an obvious lie, said grandmother had never set up any trust, that dad had just forged some papers and I'd signed them without reading because I was too stupid to think my own family would steal from me. They all laughed at that, all four of them. My parents, my siblings, laughing about how they'd stolen $50,000 from me and I'd never figured it out. Colton said I actually believed they loved me. What a complete idiot. Said they'd been taking advantage of me for years and I just kept coming back for more. Kept trying to be the good son and good brother. Kept showing up to help with whatever they needed. He called me a doormat. A useful doormat. Dad told them to keep playing nice, that I trusted them completely and would never suspect anything. That as long as they stayed friendly to my face, I'd keep believing everything was fine. Mom agreed, said I was so desperate for family approval that I'd accept any treatment as long as they occasionally threw me a bone of affection. I kept folding cardboard, methodically, one box after another. My hands were shaking, but I kept working, kept breaking down boxes, kept stacking them, and I memorized every single word they said, every laugh, every casual comment about how stupid I was, every joke about how easy it had been to steal from me. They talked for maybe 20 minutes total, moved on to other topics eventually, something about Denise needing to borrow money from dad again, Colton complaining about his mortgage payment, normal family conversation, like they hadn't just been laughing about robbing me. When I finished with the boxes 30 minutes later, I walked into the kitchen with a smile on my face and asked if anyone wanted pizza for dinner. They all said yes, absolutely. What a great idea. Colton clapped me on the back and called me a good brother. Dad asked me to grab some beer while I was out. Mom hugged me and said she was so glad I'd come over to help. I ordered the pizza from the place they like, the one that's more expensive but makes it exactly how Dad wants. Picked up the beer Colton drinks, the imported stuff that costs twice as much as domestic. Came back, ate with them, laughed at their jokes, helped clean up the kitchen when we were done, told them I'd be back next weekend if they needed help with anything else. Then I drove home to my tiny apartment, sat down at my kitchen table and started making phone calls. Update 1. Okay, so a lot of you have been asking what happened next and what I meant by making phone calls. Let me walk you through the week after I found out my family had been stealing from me, because this is where it gets interesting. First thing Monday morning, I called in sick to work. I never call in sick. I'm the guy who shows up even when I have the flu because I don't want to let my team down. But that Monday, I told my manager I had a family emergency and needed a few days, and he actually sounded concerned because, again, I never asked for time off. He told me to take whatever I needed. I spent that entire day calling lawyers, not just any lawyers, but specifically estate attorneys who handle probate and inheritance disputes. I went through every review site I could find, read hundreds of testimonials, made a spreadsheet comparing their experience levels and fee structures. By the end of the day, I had consultations scheduled with 3 different attorneys for that week. The first consultation was Tuesday morning. The lawyer's name was Michelle. She was probably in her late 40s, had been practicing estate law for 20 years, and she did not sugarcoat anything. I sat in her office and told her everything about grandmother's death 4 years ago, about the supposed trust, about the papers Dad had me sign, about finally figuring out there was no trust and the money was just gone. She asked if I had any documentation. I pulled out my phone and showed her photos I'd taken of every single paper I'd ever signed related to the inheritance. I'm not naturally a suspicious person, but I'm organized. I keep digital copies of everything important, and apparently that was about to pay off in ways I never imagined. Michelle looked through the documents and her expression got darker with each one. She told me that based on what I'd signed, my father had essentially been given power of attorney over my inheritance specifically. The paper stated I was authorizing him to manage the funds on my behalf until certain conditions were met, but those conditions were vague enough that he could have interpreted them however he wanted. More importantly, there was no actual trust mentioned anywhere in the legal documents. That had just been a story. She asked if I had any proof that the inheritance existed in the first place. I showed her the email from grandmother's attorney from 4 years ago, the one that had listed all three grandchildren as beneficiaries and specified the amounts. I'd saved it because it felt important at the time, even though I hadn't looked at it in years. Michelle told me this was definitely theft, probably fraud, and possibly forgery depending on what signatures appeared on various bank documents. She said my father had violated his fiduciary duty as executor and had likely committed several crimes. She also said that going after him legally would mean going after my entire family, because based on what I'd overheard, they were all complicit. Colton had clearly benefited from the money. Denise knew about it. Mom was involved. This wasn't going to be a simple civil case where we asked nicely for the money back. I told her I understood. I told her I wanted to pursue every available legal option. She quoted me her retainer fee, and I almost passed out. $5,000 just to get started, with hourly rates after that. But I had savings. I'd been living like a broke college student for 4 years, while my family spent my money. I had enough to afford a lawyer. I hired her that day. The next step was gathering evidence, and this is where it got complicated. I needed to prove that grandmother had left me money, that Dad had control of it, and that the money had been spent on things that benefited the family instead of being held for me. Michelle explained that we'd need bank records, property records, any documentation of large purchases or deposits that coincided with the timing of the inheritance distribution. She filed a request for estate records from the probate court. As a beneficiary, I had the legal right to see how the estate had been administered. She also sent a formal letter to my father requesting a full accounting of my inheritance funds. The letter was professionally worded, but the meaning was clear: show us where the money went or face legal consequences. That letter got sent on Thursday. I knew my parents would receive it Friday or Saturday at the latest. Meanwhile, I was playing the perfect son. I texted Dad on Wednesday asking if he needed help with anything that weekend. I sent Mom a funny meme she'd like. I messaged the family group chat about maybe doing dinner together soon. I acted exactly the way I always had. Available, helpful, eager to please. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about taking legal action against your family. You can't let them know it's coming. If they suspected I was building a case, they could destroy evidence, move money around, get their stories straight. Michelle had been very clear about this. The element of surprise was crucial. Friday afternoon, I got a text from Dad. Just checking in. Wanted to see how I was doing. Maybe grab lunch this weekend. Super casual, super normal. Exactly the kind of text he'd sent me 100 times before. I said, sure, sounds great. How about Sunday brunch? He said, perfect. Saturday morning, Michelle called me. The probate records had come through faster than expected, and she'd spent Friday evening going through them. She told me she had good news and bad news. The good news was that the records clearly showed grandmother had left me $50,000. The bad news was that according to the executor's final accounting, my inheritance had been distributed to me in full 4 years ago. Someone had signed for it. Someone had deposited the check. And according to the bank records that were part of the estate file, that someone had been me. Except I'd never received any check. I'd never signed on anything acknowledging receipt of the money. I'd never deposited $50,000 into any account I owned. Michelle asked if I'd ever given my father access to my bank accounts. I told her no, absolutely not. She asked if I'd ever signed any documents at a bank with my father present. I thought about it, and remembered that yes, actually, when I was 22 and had just started my first job, Dad had taken me to his bank to set up a proper checking account. He'd said his bank had better interest rates for savings accounts and I should consolidate my money there. I'd filled out a bunch of forms and he'd been right there the whole time, being helpful and fatherly. She asked which bank. I told her. She was quiet for a moment and then said that was the same bank where the inheritance check had been deposited. I'm not stupid. I understood what she was implying. My father had somehow gotten access to my account, or opened an account in my name, or forged my signature on the deposit. The money had gone into an account he controlled, and then it had disappeared into whatever purchases he and the rest of the family had made over the past 4 years. Michelle said this elevated everything. This wasn't just breach of fiduciary duty anymore. This was identity theft, forgery, wire fraud, theft of a substantial amount. This was serious criminal territory. She said she could refer me to a criminal attorney if I wanted to press charges, or we could handle it through civil litigation and let the district attorney decide whether to get involved once everything came out. I asked what she recommended. She said that depended on what I wanted. Did I want my money back or did I want my family in prison? I told her I wanted both, but if I had to choose, I wanted my money back and I wanted them to face real consequences. I wanted them to understand they couldn't just steal from me and laugh about it. She said we'd start with civil litigation and see where it went. She'd file a lawsuit against my father as executor for misappropriation of estate funds, and against Colton and Denise as recipients of stolen property if we could prove they'd benefited from my money. She'd also file a complaint with the state bar about the attorney who'd handled the estate, because if he'd signed off on fraudulent documents, he needed to be held accountable too. All of this would become public record. All of this would be out in the open. There would be no quietly sweeping it under the rug. I told her to do it. File everything. I was done protecting them. Sunday morning came and I met Dad for brunch at this place he likes. The one with the expensive omelets and bottomless mimosas. He was already there when I arrived, sitting at a booth looking completely relaxed. He smiled when he saw me, stood up to give me a hug, asked how I'd been. We sat down and ordered food. He talked about the weather, about some project he and Mom were planning for the backyard, about Colton's daughter's upcoming birthday party. Normal dad stuff. Normal conversation. Then he mentioned he'd gotten some weird letter from a lawyer about grandmother's estate. Said it must be some kind of scam. People trying to cause trouble. He laughed about it. Said he'd thrown it away because it was obviously fake. I took a sip of my coffee and asked what the letter said. He waved his hand dismissively and said it was nonsense about providing documentation, like the estate hadn't been settled years ago. He said some people just can't let things go, always trying to stir up drama. I asked if he'd kept the letter. He said no, he'd tossed it. Why would he keep junk mail? Our food arrived. Dad started eating his omelet and talking about whether I'd be free to help him install some new shelving in the garage next weekend. He needed someone tall to hold things in place while he drilled. Classic dad move. Ask for a favor while acting like we're just having a nice family meal. I told him I might be busy next weekend. He looked surprised. I was never busy. I was always available when they needed something. He asked what I had going on. I told him I had some personal stuff to take care of, some legal matters I was dealing with. Nothing major, just boring adult paperwork. He got very still, asked what kind of legal matters. I told him estate stuff, actually. Just making sure everything with grandmother's inheritance was properly documented. Getting my affairs in order. You know how it is. The color drained from his face. He put down his fork and asked why I was suddenly so interested in the estate. I smiled and said I'd been thinking about buying property soon. Wanted to make sure I had access to all my assets. Speaking of which, when did he think that trust would finally be ready to distribute? It had been almost 4 years. Dad said we should talk about this later, not at brunch. I said sure, no problem. We could talk about it whenever he wanted. I had plenty of time now that I'd hired an attorney to help me sort through everything. He asked what attorney. I told him her name. I told him she specialized in estate litigation and inheritance disputes. I told him she'd been very interested in my case. Dad stood up, said he needed to use the restroom. He walked away from the table and I watched him pull out his phone before he even made it to the hallway. He was calling someone. Mom, probably. Or maybe Colton. Didn't matter. I finished my omelet. It was pretty good. Definitely worth the $22 Dad was going to pay for it since he'd insisted on treating me to brunch. He came back 10 minutes later looking stressed, sat down, and asked what exactly I'd told this lawyer. I said the truth, that I'd been waiting 4 years for my inheritance and was starting to have questions about where the money was, that I wanted to see the trust documents, that I wanted a full accounting of the funds. Dad told me I was being ridiculous, that I was going to embarrass the family over nothing. I asked how wanting my own money was embarrassing. He said I was implying he'd done something wrong, that I was accusing him of theft. I didn't say I was accusing him of anything. I just said I wanted transparency. If everything was legitimate, then the documentation would prove it and we'd all move forward. Simple. He tried a different approach. Started talking about how family was more important than money, how grandmother would be so disappointed if we fought over her estate, how I was letting outside people poison my mind against my own parents. He got emotional, said he'd always tried to do right by me, that this was how I repaid him for being a good father. I listened to all of it, and then I paid for my own meal, told him to have a good rest of his weekend, and left. Update 2. So yeah, my phone started ringing before I even got to my car. And honestly, I'd been expecting it. What I wasn't expecting was the sheer volume of calls and messages that came in over the next 48 hours. Let me break down what happened because some of you asked for every detail, and trust me, you're going to want to hear this. First call was from Mom. Literally 30 seconds after I left the restaurant. I didn't answer. She called again and again. By the time I got home, I had 6 missed calls from her, 4 from Dad, and a string of texts from Colton telling me to call Dad back immediately, that this was serious, that I was being ridiculous. I made myself lunch. A proper lunch, not ramen. I grilled a steak I'd been saving, made a salad, poured myself a glass of decent wine I'd bought on sale last month. I sat at my kitchen table and ate slowly, while my phone buzzed itself into a frenzy on the counter. Around 3 in the afternoon, Denise called. I actually answered this one because I was curious what angle she'd take. She immediately started crying, asking why I was doing this to the family, saying she didn't understand where this was coming from. She said I was breaking Mom's heart and Dad was so upset he could barely function. I asked her what specifically I was doing. She said I was accusing Dad of stealing, that I was threatening legal action, that I was tearing the family apart over money. I told her I wasn't accusing anyone of anything. I'd simply hired a lawyer to help me understand what happened to my inheritance. If Dad had legitimate documentation showing the money was properly handled, then great. We'd clear everything up and move forward. She switched tactics, started talking about how the family had always supported me, how they'd been there for me when I had nothing, how ungrateful I was being. I asked her to specify when exactly they'd supported me financially, because I couldn't recall a single instance. She got flustered and said support wasn't always about money. It was about emotional support and being there for each other. I asked if stealing $50,000 from me counted as emotional support. She said I was twisting everything, that I didn't understand how these things worked, that estate stuff was complicated, and I was too immature to grasp the nuances. I told her I was 28 years old with a college degree and a successful career. I thought I could probably grasp basic theft. She hung up on me. 10 minutes later, Colton called. He didn't bother with the emotional manipulation. He went straight for aggression, told me I was being an idiot, that I was going to regret this, that I had no idea what I was starting. He said family issues should be handled privately, not through lawyers and courts. I agreed completely. Dad should have handled my inheritance privately and correctly instead of stealing it. Colton said I had no proof of anything, that I was making accusations based on paranoia. I told him the probate records showed very clearly that grandmother left me money, and that according to the executor's accounting, I'd received it even though I'd never seen a penny. I asked him where he thought I'd deposited $50,000 4 years ago when I was making $38K a year and living in a studio apartment. He got quiet for a second. Then he said maybe I'd spent it and forgotten. Maybe I'd made bad investments. Maybe I was bad with money and didn't want to admit it. I laughed out loud at that one. I told him my credit score was 780. I had no debt, and I'd saved over $40,000 in 4 years while living on entry-level wages. I was probably the most financially responsible person in the entire family. He told me I'd always been weird about money, always cheap, always acting like I was better than everyone else because I didn't spend on nice things. I said no. I was careful with money because I had to be, because my inheritance had been stolen, and I'd had to build everything from scratch while my family lived off what should have been mine. That's when he said it. He said I'd always been the weak one, the one who didn't deserve nice things because I wouldn't take them. He said people like him and Denise were winners, people who saw opportunities and took them. People like me just sat around waiting for life to hand us things and then complained when it didn't work out. I asked if opportunity meant stealing from family members. He said it meant being smart enough to recognize when someone was too passive to fight back. He said Dad had offered them a chance to benefit from my inheritance, and they'd taken it because they knew I'd never do anything about it. I was too weak, too desperate for approval, too pathetic to ever stand up for myself. There it was, the real reason. They didn't steal from me because they needed the money. Colton had a good job. Denise had her husband's income. My parents had their pensions and social security. They stole from me because they could, because they'd spent my entire life watching me be the easy kid, the compliant kid, the one who never caused problems. And they'd decided that made me a target instead of a person. I told Colton thank you for clarifying that. It would be very helpful for the lawsuit. He said I'd regret threatening him. I said I wasn't threatening anyone. I was just pursuing what was legally mine, and I hung up. Sunday evening, my parents showed up at my apartment. I have a camera doorbell, cheap one I'd installed myself last year, and I watched them ring the bell 3 times before I answered the intercom. Dad asked if they could come up and talk. I said we could talk right there through the intercom. Mom started crying, said I was being cruel, that they'd driven all the way over here to work things out, and I wouldn't even let them in. I said they could have called first to ask if I was available for visitors. Dad said they needed to handle this as a family, face to face. I went downstairs. Didn't invite them up, but I went down to the lobby. Mom immediately tried to hug me and I stepped back. She looked hurt, but I didn't care anymore. We sat in the lobby chairs, me on one side and them on the other, and Dad started talking. He said I'd misunderstood everything. The inheritance had been complicated because of taxes and legal issues. He'd used some of my money temporarily to help Colton with his house down payment, but it was always meant to be paid back. He'd made investments with another portion that hadn't worked out the way he'd hoped. These things happened. It wasn't theft, it was family helping family, and I was being selfish for not understanding that. I asked why he'd never told me any of this 4 years ago. Why the story about a trust? Why the constant delays and excuses? He said he didn't want me to worry about the details. He was handling it as my father and I should have trusted him. I asked where the money was now. He said it was gone, invested in various family needs over the years. He couldn't just produce $50,000 out of nowhere. I asked if he'd used my money to renovate his kitchen. He said the kitchen was barely $10,000. That wasn't the issue. I pointed out that was still $10,000 of my money that went into his house. Mom jumped in, said I was being hateful and cruel, that I'd always been a cold person who cared more about money than family. She said I'd never appreciated anything they'd done for me, never thanked them for raising me, never contributed to the family the way Colton and Denise did. She said maybe if I'd been more involved in family life, more generous with my time and energy, they wouldn't have felt justified in using my inheritance for family purposes. I asked if she was seriously saying they stole from me because I didn't visit enough. She said it wasn't stealing. It was a reallocation of family resources, and if I'd been a better son, I would have offered the money willingly anyway. That's when I understood something important. In their minds, they genuinely believed they'd done nothing wrong. They'd looked at me, quiet, compliant, isolated Tiago, and decided I didn't really need the money because I wasn't doing anything important with my life anyway. No wife, no kids, no expensive hobbies, just work and my tiny apartment. What did I need $50,000 for? Meanwhile, Colton was building a real life with a house and family. Denise was creating experiences and memories. My parents were improving their retirement home. They'd decided their needs were more valid than mine, and my compliance over the years had confirmed for them that I agreed. Every time I'd accepted another excuse, every time I'd helped them with house projects, every time I'd smiled and played the good son, I'd been telling them I didn't care enough to fight back. They weren't wrong about who I'd been, but they'd miscalculated who I'd become. I told them the lawyer had already filed the civil suit. Dad's face went pale. I told them the probate court would be investigating the estate administration. Mom started crying harder. I told them I'd also contacted the bank about the fraudulent account activity and they were launching their own investigation. Dad said I was destroying the family over nothing. I said they'd destroyed whatever family we had the moment they decided I was worth less than them. I said I'd spent 4 years being the perfect victim. Isolated, compliant, grateful for scraps of affection. And they'd gotten so comfortable with it they'd actually laughed about it in their own kitchen. Mom asked how I knew about that. I told her I'd been in the garage that Saturday, folding cardboard boxes while they discussed how pathetic I was. I'd heard every word, every joke about how stupid I was, every comment about how I had no one who'd notice or care, every laugh about how I believed they loved me. The silence in that lobby was absolute. Mom's tears stopped. Dad's mouth opened, but nothing came out. They hadn't realized I knew about the conversation. They'd thought I was just upset about the money. I told them they were right about one thing. I had been pathetic. I had been weak. I had let them treat me like I was worthless because I wanted so badly to believe I had a family who loved me. But I was done with that now. I was done being the easy target. I was done pretending their behavior was acceptable just to keep the peace. Dad tried to recover. Said we could work this out privately. He'd find a way to pay me back over time. We didn't need courts and lawyers. I asked how he planned to pay back $50,000 when he'd just said it was gone. He said he'd take out a loan, refinance the house, something. Just drop the lawsuit and give him time. I told him no. The lawsuit was moving forward. If he wanted to negotiate a settlement through our lawyers, that was fine. But I was done having family meetings where they manipulated and gaslit me. Everything from now on would be in writing, through official channels with legal documentation. Mom said I'd regret this, that I was going to end up alone, that no one would want a relationship with someone so vindictive and cruel. That family was all anyone really had in life, and I was throwing it away over money. I stood up and told them they'd already taken my family away when they chose to steal from me. This wasn't me throwing anything away. This was me finally admitting what they'd done years ago. I walked back to the elevator and left them sitting in the lobby. My phone exploded overnight. Texts from extended family members, aunts, uncles, cousins I hadn't talked to in years. Apparently, my parents had called everyone they knew to tell them I was suing Dad over a misunderstanding about inheritance, that I was being greedy and vindictive, that I was trying to destroy the family. The messages ranged from people telling me to drop it and be the bigger person, to people saying I should be ashamed of myself for attacking my elderly parents. I didn't respond to any of them. There was no point. They'd heard my parents' version and had already decided I was the villain. Nothing I said would change their minds until the court documents became public record, and they could see for themselves what had really happened. Michelle called Monday morning. The bank had responded to our inquiry and confirmed that there was indeed an account opened in my name 4 years ago at the branch where my father did his banking. The account showed a deposit of $50,000, followed by multiple withdrawals over the next 6 months that drained it completely. The signature on the account opening documents wasn't mine. She'd compared it to my actual signature, and the difference was obvious. She asked if I wanted to file a police report for identity theft and bank fraud. I said yes. Final update. All right, this is the final update, and I know a lot of you have been waiting to hear how this all played out. Buckle up, because the last 3 weeks have been absolutely insane. So after I filed the police report on Monday, things moved faster than I expected. The bank fraud investigation triggered an automatic hold on my parents' accounts while they verified the signatures and transactions. Apparently, when there's potential identity theft involved, banks don't mess around. My parents found out about the freeze on Tuesday when Mom tried to use her debit card at the grocery store, and it got declined. Dad called me 17 times that day. 17. I didn't answer any of them. He left voicemails ranging from angry to pleading to threatening. The gist was that I was ruining their lives. They couldn't access their own money because of me. How dare I involve the bank? This was family business. The last voicemail he left Tuesday night, his voice was shaking, and he said if I didn't fix this immediately, there would be serious consequences. I forwarded all the voicemails to Michelle. She said to keep everything, document everything, don't engage directly. Wednesday afternoon, Denise showed up at my workplace. I work in a secure building and she couldn't get past the lobby, but she sat there for 2 hours waiting for me to come down. Building security finally called me and asked if I knew someone named Denise, who was insisting she needed to see me for a family emergency. I told them I didn't want to see her and she wasn't welcome. They escorted her out. She sent me a long text afterwards saying I was being dramatic and childish, that I was taking this too far, that I needed to think about what I was doing to Mom and Dad. She said they were elderly and stressed and this could literally kill them. She said if something happened to either of them because of the strain I was putting them under, it would be my fault and I'd have to live with that forever. I didn't respond, but I did screenshot the message. Emotional manipulation and guilt tripping. Right there in writing. Thursday, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was Colton's wife, Vanessa, who I'd met maybe 5 times total at family gatherings. She said she needed to talk to me about what was happening with the family. I asked how she got my number, and she said Colton gave it to her. Vanessa told me she'd had no idea about any of this until Colton came home furious on Sunday night after our phone call. She said he'd been acting strange all week, stressed and angry, and finally told her that I was suing Dad and trying to destroy the family. She asked me to explain what was actually going on. I gave her the short version: grandmother's inheritance, the fake trust, the stolen money. Overhearing them laugh about it, she was quiet for a long time. Then she asked if it was true that Colton had benefited from my money. I told her yes. According to what Dad had admitted, some of my inheritance went toward Colton's house down payment. She said some things were starting to make sense now. 4 years ago, when they'd bought the house, she'd asked Colton where the down payment money came from because they hadn't had that much saved. He'd told her his parents had given him an early inheritance, that they wanted to help him get established. She'd thought it was weird at the time, but hadn't pushed it. She asked how much money was involved. I told her $50,000 total. I didn't know exactly how much had gone to Colton versus Denise versus my parents' renovations. She got very quiet again and then said she needed to go, but she was sorry this had happened to me. That call bothered me more than the others because Vanessa seemed genuine. She wasn't trying to manipulate me or defend anyone. She just sounded tired and disappointed. Friday morning, Michelle called with an update. The civil lawsuit had been officially served to my father, Colton, and Denise. They each had 30 days to respond. She'd also received a preliminary report from the bank's fraud investigation showing clear discrepancies between my actual signature and the signature on the fraudulent account documents. The The district attorney's office had been notified and was reviewing the case for potential criminal charges. She said this was the point where people usually tried to settle, because once criminal charges were filed, everything got exponentially more complicated and expensive. She asked if I'd be open to a settlement discussion if my father's attorney reached out. I told her yes, but only if it involved full repayment plus interest, a written admission of what they'd done, and them covering all my legal fees. She said that was reasonable, and she'd communicate that if anyone contacted her. That evening, my phone started ringing again. Dad, Mom, Colton, Denise, various family members. I ignored all of them. Around 11 p.m., I got a text from Dad's number, but it was clearly Mom writing. She said they needed to talk to me urgently, that they'd made mistakes, but they were family and we could work this out. Please just give them a chance to explain everything properly. I turned my phone on, do not disturb, and went to sleep. Saturday morning at 3 a.m., someone started pounding on my apartment door. Loud, aggressive, constant pounding. I jolted awake, completely disoriented, grabbed my phone and checked the doorbell camera. It was all four of them, Mom, Dad, Colton, and Denise, standing in my hallway at 3 in the morning. Dad was the one pounding. He was yelling through the door that I needed to open up right now, that we needed to talk, that this had gone far enough. Mom was crying. Colton was on his phone, probably trying to call me. Denise looked furious. I didn't open the door. I pulled up the camera app on my phone and started recording. Dad kept pounding and yelling about how I was destroying the family, how I needed to withdraw the lawsuit immediately, how they couldn't live like this. He said their accounts were frozen. They couldn't pay their bills. The humiliation of having everyone in the family know what was happening was unbearable. Colton started yelling too, said I was being vindictive and cruel, that I'd always been jealous of him, and this was my way of finally getting back at him for being more successful. Said I was a pathetic loser who couldn't stand to see other people happy. Said I'd never had a real relationship or real friends because I was fundamentally broken, and everyone could see it. Mom kept crying and saying I was killing them, that this stress was too much, that they were old and couldn't handle this. She said she was my mother, and I owed her respect, that everything they'd done had been for the family's good and I was being selfish. Denise said if I didn't open the door and talk to them like an adult, they'd know I was too cowardly to face them. She said I was hiding behind lawyers because I was too weak to handle family problems directly. The pounding continued. My neighbor's lights started coming on. I heard someone in the hallway ask what was going on. Dad told them it was a family matter and to mind their own business. I called the police, told them my family was harassing me at my apartment at 3 in the morning, refusing to leave, disturbing the peace. The dispatcher said officers were on the way. The pounding stopped when they heard sirens. I watched through the camera as they realized the cops were coming. Dad looked panicked. Colton said they needed to leave now, but it was too late. 2 police officers came up the stairs before they could get to the elevator. The officers asked what was going on. Dad tried to explain it was just a family disagreement. They were trying to talk to their son who was being difficult. One of the officers asked if I'd invited them to come at 3 a.m. I opened my door at that point and said, no, absolutely not. I'd asked them multiple times over the past week not to contact me, and they'd shown up at my workplace and now my home in the middle of the night. The officer asked if I wanted to press charges for harassment. I hesitated. Mom looked at me with this expression like she couldn't believe I'd actually consider it. Like even after everything, I wouldn't really go that far. I said yes, I wanted to press charges. The officers took statements from everyone. My neighbors had come out by then and confirmed the noise and pounding. One neighbor said they'd recorded video on their phone because they'd thought it might be a domestic violence situation. The officers took that as evidence too. Mom started crying harder, said I was sending my own parents to jail. Dad looked defeated. Colton called me something I won't repeat here. Denise just stared at me like she was seeing someone she'd never met before. The officers issued citations for disturbing the peace and harassment, and told my family they needed to leave immediately and could not contact me again or they'd be arrested. Dad tried to argue that they had a right to talk to their own son. The officer said no, actually. I was an adult and had clearly stated I didn't want contact, which meant they needed to respect that. They left. The hallway finally got quiet. My neighbors went back to their apartments. The officers asked if I felt safe or if I needed any additional protection. I said I was fine. I just wanted to be left alone. They gave me a case number and left. I went back inside and sat on my couch for a while. The sun was starting to come up. I made coffee. I thought about everything that had happened over the past 3 weeks, and particularly about that moment in my parents' garage when I'd heard them laughing about me. They'd truly believed I was too weak to fight back, too desperate for family to ever risk losing them, too pathetic to demand what was mine. And honestly, they hadn't been wrong about who I'd been. For years, I'd absorbed their treatment because I didn't want to admit that my family didn't actually love me. I'd made excuses for their behavior because accepting the truth was too painful. I'd played the role they'd assigned me because at least it meant I belonged somewhere. But somewhere along the way, maybe during those 4 years of eating ramen in my studio apartment, maybe during all those extra shifts I'd worked, maybe during all those nights I'd gone to sleep in silence because I had no one to talk to, I'd changed. I'd built a life based on my own effort. I'd developed skills and saved money and created stability entirely separate from them. I'd become someone who didn't need their approval to know I had value. They'd missed that transformation completely because they'd never bothered to see me as anything other than what they'd decided I was. Monday morning, Michelle called again. Dad's attorney had reached out about settlement discussions. They were proposing to pay back $30,000 over 10 years with no interest, in exchange for dropping all civil and criminal charges. Michelle asked what I thought. I told her no. $50,000 plus interest paid within 6 months, with a written and signed admission of exactly what they'd done. Or we proceed to court. She said she'd communicate that. 2 days later, they came back with $40,000 paid over 3 years. Still no admission of wrongdoing. I said no. 1 week after the 3 a.m. incident, their attorney called Michelle directly and asked what it would take to settle this. Michelle laid out my terms again. There was a long silence. Then the attorney said his clients were considering filing for bankruptcy to discharge the debt. Michelle told him that criminal charges couldn't be discharged in bankruptcy, and if they filed bankruptcy to avoid paying me, she'd make sure the district attorney knew they were trying to escape the consequences of their crimes. The criminal case would proceed regardless. Another week passed. I went to work, came home, lived my life. The family group chat that I'd been part of for years went completely silent. None of them tried to contact me. I imagined they were huddling together, trying to figure out their next move, probably still talking about how unreasonable I was being. Then Vanessa called again. She said Colton had moved out. She'd asked him point blank how much of my money had gone into their house, and he'd admitted it was $15,000. She'd told him she wanted no part of money that was stolen from his brother, and either he figured out how to pay me back his portion, or she was done. He'd told her she was being dramatic and unrealistic, that family money was complicated, and she didn't understand how these things worked. She'd told him she understood theft perfectly well. He'd packed a bag and left. She said she wanted to help make this right. She couldn't come up with $15,000 immediately, but she could do monthly payments if I'd be willing to accept that from her directly. She said what Colton and my parents had done was wrong, and she didn't want her daughter growing up thinking that kind of behavior was acceptable. I told her I appreciated that more than she knew, but she wasn't responsible for her husband's choices. She said maybe not, but the house was in both their names, and some of that stolen money had benefited her too, even if she hadn't known about it. She wanted to do the right thing. We worked out a payment plan, $300 a month for 50 months. It wasn't much, but it was something. And more importantly, it was someone in my family finally acknowledging that what had happened was theft. Last week, Michelle called with the final update. My father's attorney had contacted her with a settlement offer. Full repayment of $50,000 plus $6,000 in interest, to be paid within 90 days. Written admission of misappropriation of estate funds. Agreement to cover all my legal fees. In exchange, I'd drop the civil suit and request that the district attorney not pursue criminal charges. Michelle said the DA's office was likely to agree to that because they'd gotten the restitution they'd want and could avoid a trial. She asked if the terms were acceptable. I said yes. The settlement was signed 4 days ago. I don't know where they got the money. Maybe they took out a loan against their house. Maybe Denise's husband helped. Maybe they sold things. I don't actually care. The money hit my account yesterday. $56,000. 4 years late, but finally mine. I also got the written statement. 3 pages of my father admitting that he'd misappropriated my inheritance, forged bank documents, and distributed my money to family members without my knowledge or consent. It's notarized and part of the legal settlement. It exists. It's real. No one can ever say I made this up or misunderstood what happened. I haven't heard from any of them since the settlement was finalized. No apologies, no attempts at reconciliation. I think they're waiting to see if I'll reach out first, if I'll be the one to try to rebuild the relationship now that the money issue is resolved. I won't be doing that. Some of you have asked if I regret how I handled this, if I wish I'd tried to work it out privately before involving lawyers and courts. The answer is no. These were people who laughed about stealing from me, who called me pathetic and weak, who showed up at my home at 3 in the morning to intimidate me into backing down. They didn't want to work things out. They wanted me to shut up and accept being robbed. I'm 28 years old, and I finally have my inheritance. I'm looking at houses now. Real houses with yards and extra bedrooms. The kind of place I should have been able to buy 4 years ago if my family hadn't decided I was too stupid to notice them stealing from me. Turns out the stupid, pathetic, weak one figured it out after all.